Hey, this is Randy. Today we're going to use the definition of the imaginary unit in order to determine what is the simplified value of I to the power of any arbitrary number. Let's do it. So we've already discussed that I is defined as the principal square root of -1. So let's start with I to the power of 0. Well, anything to the power of 0 is 1, right? One possible exception would be 0 to the power of 0, but that depends on the application, and there's strong arguments as to whether or not 0 to the power of 0 is 1. But the point is that I to the power of 0 is 1. So we can say right here, 1. Okay, what about I to the power of 1? Well, we know that I to the power of 1 is the principal square root of -1, but the most simplified way to write this is just I. So we're going to say I to the power of 1 is equal to I. There it is. What about I squared? Okay, well, think of it this way. I squared is like saying I times I, right? So let's say right here, we're going to write I times I. Okay, well, we know that I is the square root of -1, so let's replace this I and this I with the square root of -1. So if I say square root of -1 times square root of -1, just like that, that's like saying the square root of -1 squared, right? Because we're multiplying it by itself. Okay, there it is. So when we have a square root that is being squared, they cancel. So we get whatever is inside the square root, which is, let me try to point that better there, which is just -1. So I squared is simplified as -1, just like that. Okay, what about I to the power of 3? Well, let's think about this. What could we do to kind of describe I to the power of 3 in some other way? Well, we could say I to the power of 1 times I squared, right? So let's say right here, I to the power of 1 times I squared, right? Because 1 plus 2 is 3. When we add those, we're going to get I to the power of 3. Okay, well, what is I to the power of 1? And what is I squared? Well, we know that I to the power of 1 simplified is just I, right? So let's write that. And then what is the simplified value of I squared? Well, we just talked about that. That is -1. So let's rewrite I squared as -1. Now I'll move this up here again. Okay, perfect. So -1 times anything is that thing but negative, right? So I times -1 is going to give us -I, which means that I cubed is equal to -I when we simplify it. Okay, there it is. What about I to the power of 4? Well, I to the power of 4 is like saying I squared times I squared, right? So let's write I squared times I squared. Okay, there it is. Now we also just talked about that I squared is equal to -1. So this expression right here is like saying -1 times -1. And -1 times -1 is going to be +1. So I to the power of 4 simplified is just like saying 1. So we could keep going with this kind of logic and find out what is I to the 5th, I to the 6th, I to the 7th, I to the 8th, and you could keep going forever. But you don't want to take forever to find out like what is I to the power of, 45 or something like that. So we'll just do this logic with 2 more, and then we'll talk about a strategy to figure out what is the simplified value of I to any arbitrary number, to the power of any arbitrary number. So I to the 5th is like saying, well, this is like saying I to the 4th times I to the 1, right? And we just talked about the fact that I to the 4th is 1. So this right here is like saying 1 times I, or just I. So I to the 5th simplified is I. Okay, there it is. Now, I to the 6th is like saying, there's a number of ways you could think about this. You could think of it as I squared times I squared times I squared, or you could think of it as I to the 4th times I squared. So what is I to the 4th? I to the 4th is 1, as we talked about. And what is the value of I squared? Well, I squared we talked about recently is -1, right? So 1 times -1 is what we're saying right here. So 1 times -1 is -1. So rather than trying to find a pattern or try to use this logic to find I to the power of some really big number, we're going to use a strategy to find the simplified value of I to some really big arbitrary number. Okay, now you'll notice that when we have I to the power of 1, I to the power of 2, I to the power of 3, and I to the power of 4, these four answers right here, I, -1, -I, and 1 are the only possible four answers that we could get when we simplify I to the power of any arbitrary number. Okay, now let's think about I to the power of 4. I to the power of 4 is 1, right? So let's say that we had I to the power of 8. Well, I to the power of 8 is like saying I to the power of 4 times I to the power of 4. Okay, good. So I to the power of 4 is 1, and I to the power of 4 is 1. So 1 times 1 is 1, which means that I to the power of 8 is also 1. So what do you see happening here? If we have I to the power of 12, because 12 is a multiple of 4, that will also be 1. I to the 16th is 1. I to the 20th is 1. I to the 24th is 1. I to the power of any multiple of 4 is 1. So now let's think about what could we do if we have like a huge exponent. We'll start with I to the power of 43. So in this number 43, we need to find the biggest number in 43 that is a multiple of 4. Okay, so is 42? No. Is 41? No. What about 40? Yes. 40 divided by 4 is 10, right? So we could rewrite this as I to the 40 times I to the 3. So let's do that. Okay, so once again, what is I to the power of 40? Well, 40 is a multiple of 4, so this entire part of the expression is just 1. So we're saying 1 times I to the 3, or you can just say I to the 3, right? What is the value of I to the 3? Well, we just talked about the fact that I to the 3 is -I, right? So all of a sudden we realize that I to the power of 43 is the same as saying -I. Okay, let's use that same logic with I to the power of 102. So what is the biggest number inside 102 that is a multiple of 4? Is 102 a multiple of 4? No. What about 101? Also no. What about 100? Yes, because 25 times 4 is 100. So we could rewrite this as I to the power of 100 times I to the power of 2, or I squared. Okay, there it is. Let's say hypothetically that we were being asked to simplify I to the 100. Well, because 100 is a multiple of 4, we know that that would just be 1, right? But this time we have I to the power of 102. So this entire part is 1. So it's going to be 1 times I squared, or just I squared, right? What is the value of I squared? Well, we know that that is -1. So I to the power of 102 is -1. And you can use that same logic to find the simplified value of I to the power of any arbitrary number. With that, we are finished with the video on powers of the imaginary unit. See you next time. Hey.